Original Voices of Wartime, Ukraine. Presented by Ukrainian Crisis Media Center. You can't leave, you can't stay. Written by Olena Horoshok. Many Ukrainians are still in the Russia-occupied territories. Everyone has their own reasons for this, and we won't go into them now. I'll only say that under occupation, all Ukrainians grasp at each other like at a straw. That helps you believe that one day you'll be able to see with your own eyes how your enemy, whom you hate with every fiber of your being, finally leaves your homeland. However, not everyone can endure such a life for a long time. I want to tell you about my road to freedom. Indeed, the world hadn't the slightest idea who the Russian occupiers are. Sticking together.
To endure the relentless hell of Russian occupation day after day, to face your enemy without lashing out in futile rage, you need the support of your people. Sometimes it takes just a brief exchange, a few words, a glance, or a single expression that speaks louder than words to remind you that you're not alone. But when one of your fellow Ukrainians suddenly decides to leave the occupation, even if you weren't particularly close, it feels as if a piece of your heart has been torn away every time. As long as the occupation drags on, some will choose to leave, while others will stay behind, carrying the weight of this shared struggle. I was one of those who waited and believed despite everything, as well as those who one day took out their suitcases and began packing. So I understand these feelings. I waited and believed for over 18 months. It was in Kherson region. For 18 months, I had been saying goodbye to those who were leaving with a heavy heart, and I often didn't say the last word. Few people discuss their plans to flee the occupation ahead of time, only to those who are closest. They're afraid of the evil eye. They're afraid that the occupiers will force them to return home rather than allow them to leave, making the situation worse. But then my time came. When I began packing for my journey, my neighbor with whom I shared our hopes, a piece of bread, and our last penny gave me a puzzled look and said, "Maybe you'll consider? How will I be here without you? I can't take it any longer. I can't watch or wait," I responded honestly. However, it was a stranger who surprised and impressed me the most. He worked at a toy store. I visited him shortly before leaving because it was my son's birthday. Even in peacetime, children look forward to holidays, and this is especially true during wartime. We began talking while I was selecting toys, as I needed to buy something small that would not take up much space in my suitcase. It turned out that the shop owner's wife had also left the job a few months ago. He remained, waiting. I can't even recall the man's name now, but he told me he had 2 or 3 young grandchildren and his wife had gone to stay with them, so she had packed her suitcase almost entirely with toys. They waited so long for her. She left her belongings behind and gave them a vacation, the seller exclaimed enthusiastically. I smiled, because I am like that too. As we parted ways, I wished my new friend would hold on and not lose faith, despite everything. And then he started crying. So unexpected and sincere. This mature and confident man cried as he said goodbye to me, a stranger. There was everything in his tears: regret, pain, and despair. The tears that froze in my eyes were a response to his. And we didn't need to say anything at that moment.
All life in one suitcase.
It was autumn of 2023. For more than a month, the AFU had a bridgehead in Krinky, on the left bank of the Kherson region. This instilled tremendous hope in the hearts of ordinary Ukrainians under occupation. We were confident that our defenders would eventually go further and liberate our land on the Black Sea coast. A woman I know who has a young son with a disability refused to leave because she was afraid her child would not survive such a difficult journey. "Perhaps you should wait a little longer. Our guys will be here shortly. We only have to wait a little while, just 6 or 8 weeks," the scared yet hopeful mother told me when I met her at the store 2 days before my leaving. God knows I wished the same thing she did. But the decision had been made, and I was terrified not only of the occupation, but also of the bloody terror and violence committed by Russian troops as they left the occupied territories. I was afraid for myself, my child, and our lives. While packing for a long journey, I wasn't sure I would return. I wanted to believe in the best, but for some reason I packed as if I were leaving my home for good. So, which of my most valuable possessions should I take with me? What is the most valuable thing? At this point, I realize who I am. I go to the bookcase and take a lot of books, as much as will fit in my suitcase. And they're not just books. These are books written in Ukrainian and about Ukraine. Our traditions, holidays, Ukrainian culture, and lifestyle have existed since ancient times. This is what I would teach my child, I thought to myself. After a few minutes, I realized I can't fit it all in. No, I will not put the books back on the shelves. They will fit. I take my favorite black suede high heels out of my suitcase and put them back in the closet, meaning I now had room for all the books and one extra. I packed another book in my suitcase. I knew I'd have many more shoes in my life, some even better than these, but I just couldn't leave the books behind during this war. These are my most valuable possessions. Irreplaceable.
A journey I wouldn't wish on anyone.
The long-awaited morning has arrived. My mother decided to stay at home, there, and not leave with us. She just would not survive such a long journey due to her serious illness, and we all knew it. She also believed that everything would be over in a few months, asking us to stay put. I asked her not to cry as we left. It will be easier for everyone. And she didn't. Somehow, keeping herself together in that stern way older people can. I crossed the doorstep of my home, feeling as if I'm falling into a terrible abyss. In a way, this is true. Since the first day of the full-scale war, I had never left my house and could only imagine what the occupiers' checkpoints were like. Furthermore, the only way to leave the occupation for a free Ukraine was via Russia and third countries. During the initial inspection, the enemy may have asked many questions about my pre-war work as a journalist. So for me, those 18 months were like living on a reservation with no way out. And then I finally mustered the courage. A minivan arrived to pick us up. We loaded everything into the trunk and took off. But we came to a hard stop after only a few kilometers. The road was blocked by heavy, large concrete blocks laid out in a zigzag formation. The only way to proceed was to weave between them. But first, we had to explain to a freak in a balaclava and military uniform wielding a machine gun where we were headed. The driver handled the situation himself. 5 kilometers later, the situation occurred again, but this time all passengers were required to show their passports. We passed through 30 checkpoints like this in a matter of hours before reaching the administrative border with the Zaporizhia region. Each time, the Russian military stopped us, asked questions, and more often than not, checked our passports. We knew just one of such inspections could put an end to our departure. There was a man from Western Ukraine among the travelers, and the occupiers regarded him as an absolute enemy, a potential scout, spy, or whatever. They took the 45-year-old man out of the bus and interrogated him for an hour and a half in the open field. What was he doing in Kherson region of the Russian Federation, they asked. In fact, that laborer arrived in the Kherson region to work in the summer of 2021. He worked in the fields for farmers, met a woman with whom he began a relationship, and lived with her in the village. They didn't manage to formalize their marriage as the war broke out. And then they decided to leave the occupation together. But the Russians at the checkpoint had problems with his story. They told the man to take out his suitcase. They searched through his belongings. They interrogated him repeatedly. All of us who waited for him on the bus were praying constantly. And when we saw him approaching with a suitcase and passport in hand, we silently cheered to ourselves as if he were a member of our own family. As we approached the temporarily occupied territory of the Zaporizhia region, they transferred us to another bus which had more passengers. Oh my God. It was also a minibus with only a few additional seats. We would be traveling in it for at least the next 2 days. We pick up people from Melitopol and Berdansk along the way, and by the evening we arrive in occupied Mariupol. The wounded, raped, and destroyed city welcomes us with ghostly houses, black window holes, and deserted streets. It's eerie to be here, even if you're on a bus, so you hope the driver will drive through the city that Russia has transformed into a true ghost as fast as possible.
First and second class people.
Our first major inspection began in Novoazovsk about half an hour after we left Mariupol. Occupied by Russia since 2014, the city in the Donetsk region served as not only a border crossing point with the Russian Federation during the war, but also a filter for Ukrainians fleeing the occupation. We formed a long queue, had our suitcases scanned, and completed a form with numerous stupid questions. The most disgusting thing happened later, behind the door, which everyone entered alone. Men are held for 30 to 60 minutes, while women are held for slightly less. During this, our kids sleep on suitcases in the corridor. In the office, they take full face and profile photos and fingerprint us like criminals. Then there is a conversation. Our filtration, which includes 20 passengers in a minibus, begins at 8 p.m. and lasts almost until midnight. Men are more nervous. Later, I will understand why. Almost everyone on my bus is a Ukrainian patriot, possibly including spies and scouts. None of us holds a Russian passport, and now we have to go through the most difficult part to finally break free. While we wait in a queue for filtration, a large, comfortable double-decker bus approaches the checkpoint. Smiling women in mink coats and stylish men with expensive suitcases get off. They gather all the Russian passports in one hand, and a Russian customs officer takes the pile for stamping. No checks. Everything is for the uppercased. And we stand a few meters away, exhausted and nervous, with several rows of bags, waiting for our sentence. Fortunately, we all made it through the filtration in Novoazovsk. We were relieved to return to our bus, which left at midnight for the aggressor country to complete the long journey to the Latvian border. The next day, we drove northward. We saw more snow as we traveled, as well as fewer towns, villages, and signs of human life. The following day at 3 p.m., we arrived in Moscow. My emotions are even worse than when we were driving through Mariupol. I feel like I'm in the enemy's jaws, and I want to get out of here as quickly as possible. The road patrol stops the bus under the pretext of checking the driver's documents, then enters the cabin 10 minutes later and requests that we, the passengers, hand over our documents for inspection. Within a minute, the patrolman had 20 Ukrainian passports in his hands. We're standing on the highway near a field. We wait for 30 minutes, an hour and a half. My greatest fear then was that we would be returned to occupied territory after having traveled over 1,000 kilometers to freedom in 36 hours. I'm worried that they would take us to a detention center. The bus is filled with Ukrainians. Everyone was preoccupied with their own concerns until someone told a joke to lift the somber mood, which caused everyone to laugh. It was perhaps not the best timing. What if those damn patrolmen would have thought that we were mocking them? An hour and a half later, they returned our documents. Off we went.
Transition to another reality.
We had been traveling for almost 2 days. The weather changed from a mild autumn in southern Ukraine to a harsh Russian winter. It was nighttime. The driver who took us to the Russia-Latvia border crossing received a call on his cell phone from someone. He was instructed to change the route and choose another border crossing point immediately, as buses carrying Ukrainians had been waiting for filtration for 2 days where we were going. We added a loop that adds over 100 kilometers and 2 hours of travel time, but at least it finally got us to the border. However, we knew these last meters of the foot crossing would be the hardest we had seen in the last 2 days. Russians do not want to let anyone through at night. We stand in the cold for 2 to 6 hours. I freeze my toes. In the morning, they let us in one at a time. The children, frozen, exhausted, and terrified, fall asleep instantly on the cold metal benches in the corridor. After 9 a.m., they start inviting us one by one. First women, including those who have children. Men followed, and hell began. Everybody had their own experience, and no one wanted to discuss it later. We, 20 people from our bus, were stuck at this Russian border crossing for the entire day. During the filtration, a young woman took out her SIM card from her phone and swallowed it so no one would know she was a Ukrainian patriot. A man was threatened with having his knees broken simply because the phrase "how to leave occupation" appeared in his phone's Google search history. Someone was barred from entering Russia and the occupied territories for the next 50 years because the song "Putin Huilo" was restored on his cell phone. Another man in the group, a very inscrupulous and elderly teacher from Zaporizhia, never returned from filtration. Our bus waited for him for hours, but in vain. We're still not sure what happened to him. Only one can guess. Latvia greeted us warmly, despite the snow and frost. Everyone registered their arrival in the EU country at the customs post within minutes. Our hands shook with excitement. My eyes kept welling up with tears. I couldn't believe we were finally there and safe. At the checkpoint exit, a permanent tent of Latvian volunteers awaited the exhausted Ukrainian refugees. Their hot pickle soup and coffee seemed to be the most delicious we've ever had. And that was the only taste for all of us. Freedom. During those 3 days, it felt as if I had lived another long and difficult life in a parallel reality. The terror of what I went through still haunts me, and I think it always will. Even if you suppress negative thoughts during the day, the subconscious catches up with you in your dreams, bringing you nightmares. It has been 10 months since I left, and the situation on Kherson's left bank remains unchanged. The AFU was forced to leave the bridgehead in Krinky in mid-July 2024 because Russia had completely destroyed the village and reduced it to rubble in less than a year. But I know for certain that people in my region are still waiting for liberation. They believe they will have the opportunity to live under the flag of their beloved Ukraine. And recently, 10 months after I left, my mother told me for the first time that she was relieved we didn't stay.
Supported by the United States Embassy in Ukraine. The views of the authors do not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States government.